Find out what's happened today. I am Lady Rain. This is the Reader's Nook, and we are reading Chapter 17 of The Stand. Starkey was standing in front of Monitor 2, keeping an eye on Tech Second Class Frank D. Bruce. When we last saw Bruce, he was face down in a bowl of chunky sirloin soup. No change except for the positive ID. Situation normal, all fucked up. Thoughtfully, hi, go get your mitts.
Okay, excuse me.
Hands locked behind his back, like a general reviewing troops. Like General Blackjack. Nope, they were already out. Pershing. Well, then ask her. His boyhood idol. Starkey moved down to Monitor 4. The situation had changed for the better. Dr. Emanuel Eswick still lay dead on the floor, but the centrifuge had stopped at 1940 hours last night. The centrifuge had begun to emit fine tendrils of smoke. At 1995 hours, the hell is that? I don't even know. The sound pickups in Eswick's lab had transmitted a wonga 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 sort of sound that deepened into a fuller, richer, more satisfying ronk, ronk, ronk. At 2107 hours, the centrifuge had ronked its last ronk and had slowly come to rest. Was it Newton who had said that somewhere beyond the farthest star there was a body perfectly at rest? Newton had been right about everything but the distance, Starkey thought. You didn't have to go far at all. Project Blue was perfectly at rest. Starkey was very glad. The centrifuge had been the last illusion of life. And the problem he'd had Steffens run through the main computer bank. Steffens had looked at him as though he was crazy, and yes, Starkey thought he might be, was how long could the centrifuge be expected to run? The answer, which had come back in 6.6 seconds, was more or less 3 years probable malfunction. Next 2 weeks, 0.009% areas of probable malfunction bearing 38% main monitor, 16%, all others, 54%. That was a smart computer. Starkey had gotten Steffens to query it again after the actual burnout of Eswick's centrifuge. The computer communed with the engineering systems databank and confirmed that the centrifuge had indeed burned out its bearings. Remember that, Starkey thought, as his collar began to beep urgently behind him. The sound of burning bearings is the final stages of collapse is ronk, ronk, ronk. Oh, in the final stages of collapse. He went to the collar and pushed the button that snapped off the beeper. Yes, Len. Billy, I've got an urgent from one of our teams in a town called Sip Springs, Texas, almost 400 miles from Arnett. They say they have to talk to you. It's a command decision. What is it, Len? He asked calmly. He had taken over 16 downers in the last 10 hours and was, generally speaking, feeling fine. Not a sign of a ronk. Press. Oh, Jesus, Starkey said mildly. Patch them through. There was a muffled roar of static, with a voice talking unintelligibly behind it. Wait a minute, Len said. The static slowly cleared. Lion, Team Lion, do you read? Blue base. Can you read? 1, 2, 3, 4. This is Team Lion. I've got you, Team Lion, Starkey said. This is Blue base 1. Problem is coded flower pot in the contingency book, the tiny voice said. Repeat, flower pot. I know what the fuck flower pot is, Starkey said. What's the situation? The tiny voice coming from the Sip Springs talked uninterrupted for almost 5 minutes. The situation itself was unimportant, Starkey thought, because the computer had informed him 2 days ago that just this sort of situation, in some shape or form, was apt to occur before the end of June. 88% probability. The specifics didn't matter. If it had 2 legs and belt loops, it was a pair of pants. Never mind the color. A doctor in Sip Springs had made some good guesses, and a pair of reporters from the Houston Daily had linked what was happening in Sip Springs with what had already happened in Arnett, Verona, Commerce City, and a town called Pilliston, Kansas. Those were the towns where the problem had gotten so bad so fast that the army had been sent in to quarantine. The computer had a list of 25 other towns in 10 states where traces of blue were beginning to show up. Hi, I'm doing good, actually. It's a Saturday, it's kind of nice, it's cold, but not too bad. How are you doing? I'm actually in a really good mood this morning. I don't know why, but I am. It's a nice morning. So I didn't want to get out of bed, but now that I'm up, I'm actually pretty good. The Sip Springs situation wasn't important because it wasn't unique. They'd had their chance at unique in Arnett. Well, maybe. And flubbed it. What was important was that the situation was finally going to see print on something besides yellow military flimsy. Was anyway, unless Starkey took steps. He hadn't decided whether to do that or not, but when the tiny voice stopped talking, Starkey realized that he had made the decision after all. He had perhaps made it as long as 20 years ago. It came down to what was important, and what was important wasn't the fact of the disease. It wasn't the fact that Atlanta's integrity had somehow been breached, and they were going to have to switch the whole preventative operation to much less satisfactory facilities in Stovington, Vermont. It wasn't the fact that blue spread in such sneaky common cold disguise. What is important? Say again, Blue Base 1, the voice said anxiously. We did not copy. What was important was that a regrettable incident had occurred. Starkey flashed back in time 22 years to 1968. He had been in the Officers Club in San Diego when the news came about Callie and what had happened to Mealy Flower. Starkey had been playing poker with 4 other men, 2 of whom now sat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The poker game had been forgotten, utterly forgotten, in a discussion of exactly what this was going to do to the military. Not any one branch, but the entire military, in the witch hunt atmosphere of Washington's Fourth Estate. And one of their number, a man who could now dial directly to the miserable worm who had been masquerading as a chief executive since January 20th, 1989, had laid his cards carefully down on the green felt table, and he had said, "Gentlemen, a regrettable accident has occurred. And when a regrettable incident occurred. And when a regrettable incident occurs, which involves any branch of the United States military, we don't question the roots of that incident, but rather how the branches may best be pruned. The service is mother and father to us. And if you find your mother raped or your father beaten and robbed, before you call the police or begin an investigation, you cover their nakedness because you love them." Starkey had never heard anyone talk so well before or since. Now he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and fumbled out a thin blue folder bound with red tape. The legend written on the cover read, "If tape is broken, notify all security divisions at once." Starkey broke the tape. "Are you there, Blue Base 1?" the voice was asking. "We do not copy you. Repeat, do not copy." "I'm here, Lion," Starkey said. He had flipped to the last page of the book, and now ran his fingers down a column labeled Extreme Covert Countermeasures. "Lion, do you read?" "We read, 5 by Blue Base 1. "Troy," Starkey said deliberately. "I repeat, Lion. Troy. Repeat back, please. Over to you." Silence. A faraway mumble of static. Starkey was fleetingly reminded of the walkie-talkies they made as kids. 2 tin Del Monte cans and 20 yards of wax string. I say again, "Oh, Jesus," a very young voice in Sip Springs gulped. "Repeat back, son," Starkey said. To Troy?" the voice said. Then more strongly, Troy. Very good, Starkey said calmly. God bless you, son. Over and out. And you, sir, over and out. A click followed by heavy static, followed by another click, silence, and Len Creighton. Let's see. Really don't know where to sign. Oh, that is bad. Followed by another click, silence, and then Len Creighton's voice. Billy? Yes, Len. I copied the whole thing. That's fine, Len, Starkey said tiredly. You make your report as you see fit, of course. You don't understand, Billy, Len said. You did the right thing. Don't you think I know that? Starkey let his eyes slip closed. For a moment, all the sweet downers deserted him. God bless you too, Len, he said, and his voice was close to breaking. He switched off and went back to stand in front of monitor 2. He put his hands behind his back like a blackjack Pershing reviewing troops. Ugh. He regarded Frank D. Bruce in his final resting place. In a little while, he felt calm again. Going southeast out of Sip Springs on US 6, you are headed in the general direction of Houston, a day's drive away. I'm going to use this again. The car burning up the road was a 3-year-old Pontiac Bonneville, doing 80, and when it came over the rise and saw the nondescript Ford blocking the road, there was nearly an accident. The driver, a 36-year-old stringer for a large Houston daily, prompt on the power brake, and tires began to screech. The Pontiac's nose first dipping down toward the road, and then beginning to brake to the left. Holy God, the photographer in the shotgun seat cried. He dropped his camera to the floor and began to scramble his seatbelt across his middle. The driver let up on the brake, skirted the Ford on the shoulder, and then felt his left wheels start to drag in soft dirt. He matted the gas pedal, and the Bonneville responded with more traction, dragging back onto the blacktop. Blue smoke squirted from beneath the tires. The radio blared on and on. Baby, can you dig your man? He's a righteous man. Baby, can you dig your man? He trumped the brake again, and the Bonneville slewed to a stop in the middle of the hot and deserted afternoon. He drew in a ragged, terrified breath and then coughed it out in a series of bursts. He began to be angry. He threw the Pontiac in reverse and back toward the Ford and the 2 men standing behind it. Listen, the photographer said nervously. He was fat and hadn't been in a fight since the 9th grade. Listen, maybe we just better... He had thrown forward into a grunt as the stringer brought the Pontiac to another screeching halt, threw the transmission lever into park with one hard thrust of his hand, and got out. He began to walk toward the 2 young men behind the Ford, his hands doubled into fists. All right, motherfuckers, he shouted. You almost got us fucking killed, and I want... He had been in the service, 4 years in the Army, volunteer. He had just time to identify the rifles. I gotta wipe my nose here. Sorry about that. He had just time to identify the rifles as the new M3As when they brought them up from below the rear deck of the Ford. They stood shocked in the hot Texas sunshine and made water in his pants. Oh, he stood shocked and made water in his pants. He began to scream, and in his mind he was turning to run back to the Bonneville, but his feet never moved. They opened up on him, and slugs blew out his chest and groin. As he dropped to his knees, holding both hands out mutely for mercy, a slug struck him an inch over his left eye and tore off the top of his head. The photographer, who had been twisted over the back seat, found it impossible to comprehend exactly what had happened until the 2 young men stepped over the stringer's body and began to walk toward him, rifles raised. He slid across the Pontiac's seat, warm bubbles of saliva collecting at the corners of his mouth. The keys were still in the ignition. He turned the car on and screamed out just as they began shooting. He felt the car lurch to the right, as if a giant had kicked the left rear. The wheel began to shimmy wildly in his hands. The photographer bounced up and down, and the Bonneville pogoed up the road on a flat on the flat tire. A second later, the giant kicked the other side of the car. The shimmy got worse. Sparks flew off the blacktop. The photographer was whining. The Pontiac's rear tires shimmied and flapped like black rags. The two young men ran back to their Ford, whose serial number was listed among the multitude in the Army Vehicles Division at the Pentagon, and one of them drove it around in a tight, swaying circle. The nose bounced wildly as it came off the shoulder and drove over the body of the stringer. The sergeant in the passenger seat sprayed a startling sneeze onto the windshield. Good Lord. Ahead of them, the Pontiac, washing machined along on its two flat rear tires, the nose bouncing up and down. Boop, 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 boop. Behind the wheel, the fat photographer had begun to weep at the sight of the dark Ford growing in the rearview mirror. He had the accelerator pressed to the floor, but the Pontiac would do no more than 40, and it was all over the road. On the radio, Larry Underwood had been replaced by Madonna. Madonna was asserting that she was the material girl. The Ford swung around the Bonneville. For 1 second of crystal hope, the photographer thought it was going to keep right on going, to just disappear over the desolate horizon and let him alone. Then it pulled back in, and the Pontiac's wildly jittering nose caught its mud guard. There was a scream of pulling metal. The photographer's head flew forward into the wheel, and blood sprayed from his nose. Throwing terrified, creaky-necked glances back over his shoulder, he slid across the worn plastic seat as if it were grease and got out on the passenger side. He ran down the shoulder. There was a barbed wire fence, and he leaped over it, sailing up and up like a blimp. And he thought, I'm going to make it. I can run forever. He fell down on the other side as his leg caught in the barbs. Screaming at the sky, he was trying to free his pants in dimpled white flesh when the two young men came down the shoulder with their guns in their hands. Why, he tried to ask them, but all that came out of him was a low and helpless squawk, and then his brains exited the back of his head. There was no published report of disease or any other trouble in Sip Springs, Texas, that day. Chapter 18. Nick opened the door between Sheriff Baker's office and the jail cells, and they started razzing him right off. Vincent Hogan and Billy Warner were in the two saltine box cells on Nick's left. Mike Childress was in one of the two on the right. The other was empty, and it was empty because Ray Booth. Are you done? Harley. That's Timber, you dork. Tristan, please go get Timber. Thank you. He of the purple LSU fraternity ring had flown the coop. Hey, dummy, Childress called. Hey, you fucking dummy. What's gonna happen to you when we get out of here, huh? What the fuck's gonna happen to you? I'm personally gonna rip your balls off and stuff them down your throat until you strangle on them, Billy Warner told him. You understand me? Only Vince Hogan didn't participate in the razzing. Mike and Billy didn't have too much use for him on this day, June 23rd, when they were to be taken up to the Calhoun County seat and jugged pending trial. Sheriff Baker had leaned on Vince, and Vince had spilled his yellow guts. Baker had told Nick he could get an indictment against these old boys.
Hey, you're gonna want to use these bananas like super soon. Maybe even
I know. Take
now.
them out to the kitchen. Put them on the stove. Daddy can make his bread. But when it got to a jury trial, it was going to be Nick's word against these four, if they picked up Ray Booth. Nick had gained a healthy respect for Sheriff John Baker these last couple of days.
There's psychic reading at the apothecary there. I buy my incense.
Okay. It probably costs an arm and a leg, too.
I mean, that's still something we could do.
Nope, I gotta help move your sister if she comes up.
She has feet. She can move herself.
She's also sick. So is everybody else.
She can bust out her wheelchair.
No, they're probably not coming up this weekend. He was a 250-pound ex-farmer who had predictably called Big Bad John was called Big Bad John by his constituents. The respect Nick felt for him was not because Baker had given him this job, swapping out the holding area to make up for his lost week's pay, but because he had gone after the men who had beaten and robbed Nick. He had done it as if Nick were a member of one of the oldest and most respected families in town, instead of just a deaf-mute drifter. There were plenty of sheriffs here in the border south, Nick knew, who would have seen him on a work farm or a road gang for 6 months instead. They had driven out to the sawmill where Vince Hogan worked, taking Baker's private car, a power wagon, instead of the company prowler car. There was a shotgun under the dash, always locked up and always loaded, Baker said, and a bubble light Baker put on the dash when he was on police business. He put it up there when they swung into the lumberyard parking area 2 days ago. 2 days ago now. Baker had hawked, spat out the window, blew his nose, and dabbed at his red eyes with a handkerchief. His voice had acquired a nasal foghorn quality. Nick couldn't hear it, of course, but he didn't need to. It was clear enough that the man had a nasty cold. Now, when we see him, I'll grab him by the arm, Baker said. I'll ask you, is this one of 'em? You give me a nod yes, a big nod yes. I don't care if it was or not. You just nod, get it? Nick nodded. He got it. Vince was working the board planer, feeding rough planks into the machine, standing in sawdust almost to the top of his work boots. He gave John Baker a nervous smile, and his eyes flicked uneasily. No, go ahead. Uneasily to Nick standing beside the sheriff. Nick's face was thin and battered and still too pale. Hi, Big John. What you doing out with the working folk? The other men in the crew were watching all this, their eyes shifting gravely from Nick to Vance to Baker, and then back the other way, like men watching some complicated new version of tennis. Ba-doop. One of them spat a stream of honey cut into the fresh sawdust and wiped off his chin with the heel of his hand. Baker grabbed Vince Hogan by one flabby sunburned arm and pulled him forward. Hey, what's the idea, Big John? Baker turned his head to Nick so Nick could see his lips. Is this one of 'em? Nick nodded firmly and pointed at Vince for good measure. What is this? Vince protested again. I don't know this dummy from Adam. Then how come you know he's a dummy? Come on, Vince. You're going to the cooler. Toot sweet. You can send one of these boys to get your toothbrush. Protesting, Vince was led to the power wagon and deposited inside. Protesting, he was taken back to town. Protesting, he was locked up and left to stew for a couple of hours. Baker didn't bother with reading him his rights. Damn fool, just get confused, he told Nick. When Baker went back around noon, Vince was too hungry and too scared to do any more protesting. He just spilled everything. Mike Childress was in the jug by 1 o'clock, and Baker got Billy Warner at his house just as Billy was packing up his old Chrysler to go someplace. A long piece from the look of all the packed liquor store boxes and and strapped together luggage. But somebody had talked to Ray Booth, and Ray had been just smart enough to move a little quicker. Booth took Nick home to meet his wife and have some supper. In the car, Nick wrote on the memo pad, I am sure sorry it's her brother. How is she taking it? She's bearing up, Baker said. Both his voice and the set of his body almost formal. I guess she's done some crying over him, but she knew what he was. And she knows you can't pick your relatives like you do your friends. Jane Baker was a small, pretty woman who had indeed been crying. Looking at her deeply socketed eyes made Nick uncomfortable. But she shook his hand warmly and said, I'm pleased to know you, Nick, and I apologize deeply for your trouble. I feel responsible, with one of mine being a part of it and all. Nick shook his head and shuffled his feet awkwardly. I offered him a job around the place, Baker said. Station's gone right to hell since Bradley moved up to Little Rock. Painting and picking up mostly. He's gonna have to stick around for a while anyway, for the trial, yes, she said. There was a moment then in which the silence was so heavy even Nick found it painful. Then, with forced gaiety, she said, I hope you eat red-eye ham, Nick. That's what there is. Along with some corn and a big bowl of slaw. My slaw's never been up to what my mother's used to make, what his mother used to make. That's what he says anyway. Nick rubbed his stomach and smiled. Over dessert, a strawberry shortcake. Nick, who had been on short rations during the last couple of weeks, had 2 helpings. Jane Baker said to her husband, Your cold sounds worse. You've been taking too much on, John Baker, and you didn't eat enough to keep a fly alive. Baker looked guiltily at his plate for a moment and then shrugged. I can afford to miss a meal or now and then, he said, and patted his double chin. Palpitated his double chin. Nick, watching them, wondered how 2 people of such radically different size got along in bed. I guess they manage, he thought with an interior grin. They sure look comfortable enough with each other, and not that it's any of my business anyway. You're flushed, too. You carrying a fever? Baker shrugged. Nope. Well, maybe a touch. Well, you're not going out again tonight. That's final. My dear, I have prisoners. If they don't especially need to be watched, they do need to be fed and watered. Nick can do it, she said with finality. You're going to bed. And don't go on about your insomnia. It won't do you any good. I can't send Nick, he said weakly. He's a deaf mute. Besides, he ain't a deputy. Well, then, you just up and deputize him. He ain't a resident. I won't tell if you won't, Jane Baker said inexorably. She stood up and began clearing the table. Now you just go on and do it, John. And that is how Nick Andros went from show-yo prisoner to show-yo deputy in less than 24 hours. As he was preparing to go up to the sheriff's office, Baker came into the downstairs hall, looking large and ghastly in a frayed bathrobe. He seemed embarrassed to be on view in such attire. I never should have let her talk me into this, he said. Wouldn't have done either if I didn't feel so punk. My chest's all clogged up, and I'm as hot as a fire sale 2 days before Christmas. Week 2. Nick nodded sympathetically. I'm stuck between deputies. Bradley Cade and his wife went up to Little Rock after their baby passed away. One of those crib deaths. Awful thing. I don't blame them for going. Nick pointed at his own chest and made a circle with his thumb and finger. Sure, you'll be okay. You can take normal care, you hear? You just take normal care, you hear? There's a 45 in the third drawer of my desk. But don't you be taking it back there. Nor the keys either, understand? Nick nodded. If you go back there, stay out of their reach. If any of 'em tries playing sick, you don't fall for it. It's the biggest dodge in the world. If one of 'em should get sick, Doc Soames can see them just as easy in the morning. I'll be in then. Nick took his pad from his pocket and wrote, I appreciate you trusting me. Thanks for locking them up, and thanks for the job. Baker read this carefully. You're a pure D caution, boy. Where are you from? How come you out on your own like this? That's a long story, Nick jotted. I'll write some of it down for you tonight if you want. You do that, Baker said. I guess you know I put your name on the wire. Nick nodded. It was SOP, but he was clean. I'll get Jane to call Ma's truck stop out by the highway. Those boys will be hollering police brutality if they don't get their supper. Nick wrote. Have her tell whoever brings it to come right in. I can't hear him if he knocks. Okay, Baker hesitated a moment longer. You got your cot in the corner. It's hard, but it's clean. You just remember to be careful, Nick. You can't call for help if there's trouble. Nick nodded and wrote, I can take care of myself. Yeah, I believe you can. Still, I'd get someone from town if I thought any of them would. He broke off as Jane came in. You still jawing this poor boy? You let him go on now, before my stupid brother comes along and breaks them all out. Baker laughed sourly. He'll be in Tennessee by now, I guess. He whistled out a long sigh that broke up in a series of phlegmy, booming coughs. I believe I'll go upstairs and lie down, Janie. I'll bring you some aspirin to cut that fever, she said. She looked back over her shoulder at Nick as she went to the stairs with her husband. It was a pleasure meeting you, Nick. Whatever the circumstances, you be just as careful as he says. Nick bowed to her, and she dropped half a curtsy in return. He thought he saw a gleam of tears in her eyes. A pimply, curious boy in a dirty busboy's jacket brought 3 dinner trays about half an hour after Nick had gotten down to the jail. Nick motioned for the busboy to put the trays on the cot, and while he did, Nick scribbled, Is this paid for? The busboy read this with all the concentration of a college freshman tackling Moby Dick. Sure, he said. Sheriff's office runs the tab. Say, can't you talk? Nick shook his head. That's a bitch, the busboy said, and left in a hurry, as if the condition might be catching. Nick took the trays in one at a time and pushed each one through the slot in the bottom of the cell door with the broom handle. He looked up in time to catch Chick shit bastard ain't he? From Mike Childress. Smiling, Nick showed him his middle finger. Ah! I'll give you the finger, you dummy, Childress said, grinning unpleasantly. When I get out of here, Nick turned away, missing the rest. Back in the office, sitting in Baker's chair, he drew a memo pad into the center of the blotter, sat thinking for a moment, then jotted down at the top, Life Story by Nick Andros. He stopped, smiled a little. He had been in some funny places, but never in his wildest dreams had he expected to be sitting in a sheriff's office, deputized, in charge of 3 men who had beaten him up, and writing his life story. After a moment, he began to write again. I was born in Caslin, Nebraska on November 14th, 1968. My daddy was an independent farmer. He and my mom were always on the edge of getting squeezed out. They owned 3 different banks. My mother was 6 months pregnant with me, and my daddy was taking her to see the doctor in town when a tie rod on his truck let go, and they went into a ditch. My daddy had a heart attack and died. That can wait. Yes, every now and then I check my phone to see if my husband wrote or anybody needs anything. Anyway, 3 months after, my mom had me, and I was born the way I am. Sure was a tough break on top of losing her husband that way. She carried on with the farm until 1973, and then lost it to the big operators, as she always calls them. She had no family, but wrote to some friends in Big Springs, Iowa, and one of them got her a job in a bakery. We lived there until 1977, when she was killed in an accident. A man on a motorcycle hit her while she was crossing the street on her way home from work. It wasn't even his fault, but only bad luck that his brakes failed. He wasn't even speeding or anything. The Baptist church gave my mama a charity funeral. This same church, Grace Baptist, sent me to the Children of Jesus Christ Orphanage in Des Moines. This is a place that all sorts of churches chip together to support. That was where I learned to read and write. He stopped there. His hand was aching from writing so much. But that wasn't why. He felt uneasy, hot and uncomfortable at having to relive all that again. He went back to the jail quarters and looked in. Childress and Werner were asleep. Vince Hogan was standing by the bars, smoking a cigarette and looking across the corridor at the empty cell where Ray Booth would have been tonight if he hadn't run so quick. Hogan looked as if he might have been crying, and that led him back in time to that small, mute scrap of humanity, Nick Andros. There was a word he had learned at the movies as a kid. The word was incommunicado. It was a word that had always had fantastic, Lovecraftian overtones to Nick. A fearful word. that echoed and clanged in his brain. A word that inscribed all the nuances of fear that lived only outside the sane universe and inside the human soul. He had been incommunicado all his life. He sat down and reread the last line he'd written. That was where I learned to read and write. But it hadn't been as simple as that. He lived in a silent world. Writing was code. Speech was the moving lips, the rise and fall of teeth, the dance of the tongue. His mother had taught him to read lips and had taught him how to write his name in struggling, sprawling letters. That's your name, she had said. That's you, Nicky. But of course, she had said it silently, meaninglessly. The prime connection had come when she tapped the paper, then tapped his chest. The worst part about being a deaf mute was not living in a silent movie world. The worst part was not knowing the names of things. He had not really begun to understand the concept of naming until he was 4. He had not known that you called the tall green things trees until he was 6. He had wanted to know, but no one had thought to tell him, and he had no way to ask. He was incommunicado. When she died, he had retreated almost all the way. The orphanage was a place of roaring silence, where grim-faced thin boys made fun of his silence. 2 boys would run up to him, one boy with his hands plastered over his mouth, one boy with his hands plastered over his ears. If none of the staff happened to be near, they would punch him out. Why? No reason, except maybe in the vast white class of victims, there was a subclass, the victims of victims. He stopped wanting to communicate, and when that happened, the thinking process itself began to rust and disintegrate. He began to wander from place to place, vacantly, looking at the nameless things that filled the world. He watched groups of children in the play yard move their lips, raise and lower their teeth, like white drawbridges, dancing their tongues in the ritual mating of speech. He sometimes found himself looking at the single cloud for as long as an hour at a time. Then Rudy had come, a big man with scars on his face and a bald head, 6 feet 5 inches tall, might as well have been 20 to runty Nick Andros. They met for the first time in the basement room where there was a table, 6 or 7 chairs, and a TV that only worked when it felt like it. Rudy squatted, put his eyes on approximately the same level as Nick's. Then he took his huge, scabbed hands and put them over his mouth and ears. I'm a deaf mute. Nick turned his face sullenly away. Who gives a fuck? Rudy slapped him. Nick fell down. His mouth opened and silent tears began to leak from his eyes. He didn't want to be here with this scarred troll, this bald boogie. He was no deaf mute. It was a crude joke. Rudy pulled him gently to his feet and led him to a table. A blank sheet of paper was there. Rudy pointed to it, then at Nick. Nick stared sullenly at the paper, and then at the bald man. Shook his head. Rudy nodded and pointed to the empty paper again. He produced a pencil and handed it to Nick. Nick put it down as if it was hot. He shook his head. Rudy pointed to the pencil, and then at Nick, then at the paper. Nick shook his head. Rudy slapped him again. More silent tears. Scarred face looking at him was nothing but deadly patience. Oh, the scar, yeah. Rudy pointed at the paper again, at the pencil, at Nick. Nick grasped the pencil in his fist, he wrote 4 words that he knew, calling them forth from the cobwebby, rusty mechanism that was in his thinking brain. He wrote, Nicholas Andros, fuck you. Then he broke the pencil in half and looked sullenly and defiantly at Rudy. But Rudy was smiling. Suddenly he reached across the table and held Nick's head steadily between his hard, calloused palms. His hands were warm, gentle. Nick could not remember the last time he had been touched with such love. His mother had touched him like that. Rudy removed his hands from Nick's face. He picked up half the pencil with the point on it. The half of the pencil with the point on it. He turned the paper over to the blank side. He tapped the empty white space with the tip of his pencil and then tapped Nick. He did it again and again and again, and finally Nick understood. You are this blank page. Nick began to cry. Rudy came for the next 6 years, where I learned to read and write. A man named Rudy Sparkman came to help me. I was very lucky to have him. In 1984, the orphanage went broke. They placed as many kids as they could, but I was not one of them. They said I would get in with a family after a while, and the state would pay them for keeping me. I wanted to go with Rudy, but Rudy was in Africa working for the Peace Corps. So I ran away. Being 16, I don't think they looked for me too hard. I figured if I could stay out of trouble, I would be all right. And so far, so good. I have been taking the high school correspondence courses one at a time, because Rudy always said education is the most important. When I settle down for a while, I'm going to take that high school equivalency test. I will be able to pass it soon. I like school. Maybe I will go to college someday. I know that sounds crazy, a deaf-mute bum like me, but I don't think it's impossible. Anyway, that's my story. Yesterday morning, Baker had come in around 7:30 while Nick was emptying wastebaskets. The sheriff looked better. How you feeling, Nick wrote. Pretty good. I was burning up until midnight. Worst fever I've had since I was a kid. Aspirin didn't seem to help it. Janie wanted to call the doc. But around 12:30, the fever just broke. I slept like a log after that. How are you doing? Nick made a thumb and forefinger circle. How's our guests? Nick opened and closed his mouth several times in a mime jabbering. Looked furious. Made banging gestures on invisible bars. Baker threw back his head and laughed, then sneezed several times. You ought to be on TV, he said. Did you write your life story down like you said you were going to do? Nick nodded and handed the 2 sheets of longhand over. The sheriff sat down and read them carefully. When he was done, he looked at Nick so long and so piercingly that Nick stared down at his feet for a moment, embarrassed and confused. When he looked up again, Baker said, You've been on your own since you were 16? For 6 years. Nick nodded. And you've really taken all those high school courses? Nick wrote for some time on one of the memo sheets. I was way behind because I started to read and write so late. When the orphanage closed, I was just starting to catch up. I got 6 high school credits from there, and another 6 since then from LaSalle in Chicago. I learned about them from a matchbook cover. I need 4 more credits. What courses you still need? Baker asked. Then turned his head and shouted, Shut up in there! You'll get your hotcakes and coffee when I'm damn good and ready and not before. Nick wrote, Geometry, advanced math, 2 years of a language. Those are the college requirements. A language? You mean like French, German, Spanish? Nick nodded. Baker laughed and shook his head. Don't that beat all? A deaf mute learning to talk a foreign language. Nothing against you, boy. You understand that. Nick smiled and nodded. So why you been drifting around so much? While I was still a minor, I didn't dare stay in one place for too long, Nick wrote. Afraid they'll try to stick me in another orphanage or something. When I got old enough to look for a steady job, times got worse. They said the stock market crashed or something. But since I'm deaf, I didn't hear it. Ha ha. That is actually funny. Most places would have just let you ramble on, Baker said. In hard times, the milk of human kindness don't flow so free, Nick. As for a steady job, I might be able to put you onto something around here, unless those boys sour you on Shoyo in Arkansas for good. But we ain't like that. We ain't all like that. Nick nodded to show he understood. How's your teeth? That was quite a shot in the mouth you took. Nick shrugged. Take any of those pain pills? Nick held up 2 fingers. Well, look, I got some paperwork to do on those boys. You go on with what you were doing. We'll talk more later. Dr. Soames, the man who had almost hit Nick with his car, came by at 9:30 a.m. the same morning. He was a man of about 60, with the shaggy white hair, scrawny chicken neck, and very sharp blue eyes. Big John tells me you read lips, he said. He also says he wants to see you gainfully employed, so I guess I better make sure you're not going to die on his hands. Take off your shirt. Nick unbuttoned his blue work shirt and took it off. Holy Jesus, look at 'em, Baker said. They did a job of work, all right. Soames looked at Nick and said dryly, Boy, you almost lost your left tit. He pointed to the crescent-shaped scab just above the nipple. Nick's belly and ribcage looked like a Canadian sunrise. Soames poked and prodded him and looked carefully into the pupils of his eyes. At last he examined the shattered remains of Nick's front teeth, the only part of him that really hurt now, in spite of the spectacular bruises. That must hurt like a son of a bitch, he said, and Nick nodded ruefully. You're going to lose them, Soames went on. He sneezed 3 times in a quick succession. Excuse me. He began to put his tools back into his black bag. Prognosis is favorable, young man. Barring strokes of lightning or further trips to Zach's gin mill. Is your speaking problem physical, or does it come from being deaf? Nick wrote physical, birth defect. Soames nodded. Damn shame. Gotta think positive, though, and thank God that he didn't decide to give your brains a stir while he was at it. Put your shirt on. Nick did. He liked Soames. In his way, he was very much like Rudy Sparkman, who had told him once that God had given all deaf-mute males an extra 2 inches below the waist to make up for the little bit he had subtracted from above the collarbones. Oh my God. Sorry. Soames said, I'll tell him to give you a refill of that pain medication down at the drugstore. Tell Moneybags here to pay for it. Ho, ho, John Baker said. He's got more dough stashed away in fruit jars than a hog has warts, Soames went on. He sneezed again, wiped his nose, rummaged around in his bag, and brought out a stethoscope. You want to look out, Gramps. I'll lock you up for drunk and disorderly, Baker said with a smile. Yeah, Soames said. You'll open your mouth too wide one day and fall right in. Take off your shirt, John, and let's see if your boobs are as big as they used to be. Take off my shirt? Why? Because your wife wants me to look at you, that's why. She thinks you're a sick man, and she doesn't want you to get any sicker. God knows why. Ain't I told her enough times that she and I wouldn't have to sneak around anymore if you were underground? Come on, Johnny, show us some skin. It was just a cold, Baker said, reluctantly unbuttoning his shirt. I feel fine this morning, honest to God, Ambrose. You sound worse than I do. You don't tell the doctor tells you, as Baker pulled his shirt off. Soames turned to Nick and said, But you know it's funny how a cold will start making the rounds. Mrs. Lathrop is down sick, and the whole Ritchie family and most of those no-accounts out on the Baker Road are coughing their brains out. Even Billy Warner in there's hacking away. Baker had wormed out of his undershirt. There, what'd I tell you, Soames said. Ain't he got a set of knockers on him? Even an old shit like me could get horny looking at that. My God. Baker gasped as the stethoscope touched his shirt. Jesus, that's cold. What'd you do? Keep it in the deep freeze? Breathe in, Soames said, frowning. No. Now, let it out. Baker's exhale turned into a weak cough. Soames kept at the... Excuse you. Ain't nothing the hell out there. Oh my God, there's people passing. Really? Really? Harley, I am reading, thank you very much. We don't need to hear your barkiness. It's like they're barking and the people are walking away. So they're like, oh, if I bark more, then everybody that comes here will just keep on walking. That's like their mentality, I swear. Are you done? Ah. Selms kept up the sheriff for a long time, front and back both. At last, he put away his stethoscope and used the tongue depressor to look down Baker's throat. Finished, he broke it in two and tossed it in the wastebasket. Well, Baker said. Selms pressed the fingers of his right hand into the flesh of Baker's neck under the jaw. Baker winced away from it. I don't have to ask if that hurt, Selms said. John, you go home and go to bed. And that isn't advice, that's an order. The sheriff blinked. Ambrose, he said quickly, come on. You know I can't do that. I got 3 prisoners who have to go up to Camden this afternoon. I left this kid with them last night, but I have no business doing it. I had no business doing it, and I won't do it again. He's mute. I wouldn't have agreed to it last night if I had been thinking it right. You never mind them, John. You got problems of your own. It's some kind of respiratory infection, a damn good one by the sound, and a fever to go with it. Your pipes are sick, Johnny. And, to be perfectly frank, there's no joke for a man who's carrying around an extra meat you are. That's no joke. Go to bed. If you still feel okay tomorrow morning, get rid of 'em then. But better still, call the state patrol to come down and get 'em. Baker looked apologetically at Nick. You know, he said, I do feel kind of dragged out. Maybe some rest. Go home and lie down, Nick wrote. I'll be careful. Besides, I have to earn enough to pay for those pills. Nobody works so hard for you. Nobody works so hard for you as a junkie, Soames said, and cackled. Baker picked up the 2 sheets of paper with Nick's background on them. Could I take these home for Janie to read? She took a shine to you, Nick. Nick scrawled on the pad. Sure can. She's very nice. One of a kind, Baker said, and sighed as he buttoned his shirt back up. This fever's coming on strong again. Thought I had licked it. Take aspirin, Soames said, latching his bag. It's that glandular infection I don't like. There's a cigarette box at the bottom desk drawer, Baker said. Petty cash fund. You can go out for lunch and get your medication on the way. Those boys are more dildos than desperados. They'll be okay. Just leave a voucher for how much money you take. I'll get in touch with the state police, and you'll be shut of them by late this afternoon. Nick made a thumb and forefinger circle. Oop. I've been trusting you a lot on short notice, Baker said somberly, but Janie says it's all right. You have a care. Nick nodded. Jane Baker had come in around 6 yesterday evening with a covered dish supper, and a carton of milk. Nick wrote, Thanks very much. How's your husband? She laughed, a small woman with chestnut brown hair, dressed prettily in a checked shirt and faded jeans. He wanted to come down himself, but I talked him out of it. His fever is up so high this afternoon that it scared me. Oh, it was up high. But it's almost normal tonight. I think it's because of the state patrol. Johnny's never really happy unless he can be mad at the state patrol. Nick looked at her quizzically. They told him they couldn't send anybody down for his prisoners until 9 tomorrow morning. They've had a bad sick day. 20 or more troopers out. And a lot of the people who are on have been fetching people to the hospital up in Camden and even Pine Bluff. There's a lot of this sickness around. I think Aim Soames is a lot more worried than he's letting on. She looked worried herself, and she took the 2 folded sheets of memo paper from her breast pocket. This is quite a story, she said quietly, handing the papers back to him. You've had just about the worst luck of anyone I've ever heard of. I think the way you've risen above your handicaps is admirable, and I have to apologize again for my brother. Nick, embarrassed, could only shrug. I hope you'll stay in Shoyo, she said, standing. My husband likes you, and I do too. Be careful of those men in there. I will, Nick wrote. Tell the sheriff I hope he feels better. I'll take him your good wishes. She left then, and Nick passed the night of broken rest, getting up occasionally to check on the 3 wards. Desperados.
When's my sister gonna be here? Down!
I don't know if they're coming, all right?
You don't know if they're coming?
No. I'll explain in a little bit. Desperados, they were not. By 10 o'clock, they were all sleeping. 2 town fellows came in to check and make sure Nick was all right, and Nick noticed the both of them seemed to have colds. He dreamed oddly, and all he could remember was waking was that he seemed to have been walking through endless rows of green corn, looking for something and terribly afraid of something else that seemed to be behind him. So both him and Stu have dreamed of green corn. This morning he was up early, carefully sweeping out the back of the jail and ignoring Billy Warner and Mike Childress. As he went out, Billy called after him, "Ray's going to be back, you know, and when he catches you, you're going to wish you were blind as well as deaf and dumb." Nick, his back turned, missed most of this. Back in the office, he picked up the old copy of Time magazine and began to read. He considered putting his feet up on the desk and decided that would be a very good way to get in trouble if the sheriff came by. By 8 o'clock, he was wondering uneasily if Sheriff Baker might have had a relapse in the night. Nick had expected him by now, ready to turn the 3 prisoners in his jail over to the county when the state patrol came for them. Also, Nick's stomach was rumbling uncomfortably. No one had showed up from the truck stop down the road, and he looked at the telephone more with disgust than with longing. He was quite... there's one in the bathroom. I don't know where the other one is. We got to clean off the table, though. He was quite fond of science fiction, picking up falling apart paperbacks from time to time on the dusty back shelves of antique barns for a nickel or a dime, and he found himself thinking, not for the first time, that it was going to be a great day for the deaf mutes of the world when the telephone view screens, the science fiction novels were always predicting finally came into general use. And I do believe that they have those ones that you read. They've had them since the 80s. By 9:15, he was actually acutely uneasy. He went to the door which gave to the cells and looked in. Billy and Mike were both standing at their cell doors. Both of them had been banging on the bars with their shoes, which just went to show you that people who can't talk only made up a small percentage of the world's dummies. Vince Hogan was lying down. He only turned his head and stared at Nick when he came to the door. Hogan's face was pallid except for the hectic flush of his cheeks, and there were dark patches under his eyes. Beads of sweat were standing out on his forehead. Nick met his apathetic, fevered gaze, and realized the man was sick. His uneasiness deepened. "Hey, dummy, how about some breakfast?" Mike called down to him. "And old Vince there seems like he could use a doctor. Pat'll tell him don't agree with him, does it, Billy?" Bill didn't want to banter. "I'm sorry I yelled at you before, man. Vince, he's sick all right. He needs the doctor." Nick nodded and went out, trying to figure out what he should do next. He went over to the desk and wrote on the memo pad, "Sheriff Baker or whoever, I've gone to get the prisoner some breakfast and to see if I can hunt Dr. Soames up for Vince Hogan. He appears to be really sick, not just playing possum. Nick Andros." He tore the sheet off the pad and left it in the middle of the desk, then tucked the pad into his pocket, and he went out into the street. The first thing that struck him was the still heat of the day and the smell of greenery. By afternoon, it was going to be a scorcher. It was the sort of day when people like to get their chores and errands done early so they can spend the afternoon as quietly as possible. But to Nick, Shoyo's main street looked strangely indolent this afternoon, more like Sunday than a work day. Most of the diagonal parking spaces in front of the stores were empty. A few cars, farm trucks, were going up and down the street, but not many. The hardware store looked open, but the shades of the Mercantile Bank were still drawn, although it was past 9 now. Nick turned right. "What are you making? Are you putting bananas in muffins?" "Okay." Nick turned right toward the truck stop, which was 5 blocks down. He was on the corner of the 3rd block when he saw Dr. Soames' car moving slowly up the street toward him, weaving a little from side to side. "By the way, if you need to mash the bananas, you might want to mash them before you put them in." Use a potato masher. Dr.
I'm gonna
Soames,
go. If you need me, just call me.
where are you going?
Probably to buy some more incense.
All right.
If I have
Well, you want to stop at the library, see if there's any more Stephen King books besides Dreamcatcher? Little from side to side, as if with exhaustion. Nick waved vigorously, not sure if Soames would stop. But Soames pulled in at the curb, indifferently taking up 4 of the slanted parking spaces. He didn't get out, but merely sat behind the wheel. The look of the man shocked Nick. Soames had aged 20 years since he had last seen him bantering casually with the sheriff. It was partly exhaustion, but exhaustion couldn't be the whole explanation. Even Nick could see that. As if to confirm his thought, the doctor produced a wrinkled handkerchief from his breast pocket, like an old magician doing a creaky trick that does not interest him much any more, and sneezed into it repeatedly. When he was done, he leaned his head back against the car's seat, mouth half open, to draw a breath. His skin looked so shiny and yellow that he reminded Nick of a dead person. Then Soames opened his eyes and said, "Sheriff Baker's dead. If that's what you flagged me down for, you can forget it. He died a little after 2 o'clock this morning. Now Janie's sick with it." Nick's eyes widened. "Sheriff Baker's dead? But his wife has been in just last night and said he was feeling better. And she's been fine." "No, it just wasn't possible." "Dead all right," Soames said, as though Nick had spoken his thought aloud. "And he's not the only one. I signed 12 death certificates in the last 12 hours, and I know of another 20 that are going to be dead by noon unless God shows mercy. But I doubt it. This is God's doing. I suspect he's keeping right out of it as a consequence." Nick pulled his pad from his pocket and wrote, "What's the matter with them?" "I don't know," Soames said, crumpling the sheet slowly and tossing the ball in the gutter. "But everyone in town seems to be coming down with it, and I'm more frightened than I ever have been in my life. I have it myself, although what I'm suffering most from right now is exhaustion. I'm not a young man anymore. I can't do those long hours without paying the price, you know." A tired, frightened petulance had entered his voice, which Nick fortunately couldn't hear, and feeling sorry for myself won't help. Nick, who had been aware Soames was feeling sorry for himself, could only look at him puzzled. Soames got out of his car, holding on to Nick's arm for a minute to help himself. He had an old man's grip, weak and a little frenzied. "Come on over to that bench, Nick. You're good to talk to, I suppose. You've been told that before." Nick pointed back toward the jail. "They're not going anywhere," Soames said. "And if they're down with it right now, they're in the bottom of my list." They sat on the bench, which was painted bright green and bore an advertisement on the backrest for the local insurance company. Soames turned his face gratefully up to the warmth of the sun. "You okay? Okay? Do I need to help you? You okay? What are you looking for, I mean?" "It should be in that cupboard where you're at." "Tristan, have you seen the glass measuring cup?" "Ask Nick if he's seen it. It might be inside one of those other cups, too."
Why do we have unmarked?
Because I haven't marked them yet. I really should, though. They're just old. Let's see. And bore an advertisement on the backrest for a local insurance company. Soames turned his face gratefully up to the warmth of the sun. "You know, give me a few minutes. I'm going to see if I can help them. I'll be right back. We're going to read for a little bit today. All right, let me see if I can help, okay? But how much do you need? I know you need a welcome.
I didn't see it. Which Who else is gonna conjure somebody?
One. Oh God, you have 6?
Global warming's happening because we killed all the witches and they can't conjure any witch or anything.
That would be 2 of them. And the those something to snack. I'm gonna be. It's not gonna.
Ow!
Actually, it is.
You really need to get the bottom back on that, otherwise you're gonna trip and die.
Okay.
Bye.
Both. No jumping. Come on, baby. Come in here. Come on. Beep, beep. Let's go. Come on, Harley. Not like they're locked in here, but it'll keep them at least out from underneath your feet. Okay? All right, back to reading. Oh, I know what I needed Nick to do. I'm a little chilly, so yeah, maybe. Can you please bring me the heater from my room? Thank you. Right, he'll bring down the heater when he gets that. Now, let's continue, shall we? Are we still on 18? Are we really? Chapter are we on? Are we on 18? Yeah, 18's a long chapter. All right. Soames turned his face gratefully up to the warmth of the sun. Chills and fever, he said, ever since about 10 o'clock last night. Just lately, yes, it's been the chills. Thank God there hasn't been any diarrhea. You ought to go home to bed, Nick wrote. So I ought, and will. I just want to rest for a few minutes first. His eyes slipped shut, and Nick thought he had gone to sleep. He wondered if he should go on down to the truck stop and get Billy and Mike some breakfast. Then Dr. Soames spoke again without opening his eyes. Nick watched his lips. The symptoms are all very common, he said, and began to emulate them on his finger until all 10 were spread out in front of him like a fan. Chills, fever, headache, weakness in general, debilitation, loss of appetite, painful urination, swelling of the glands, progression from minor to acute, swelling of the armpits and in the groin, respiratory weakness, and failure. He looked at Nick. Those are the symptoms of the common cold, of influenza, of pneumonia. We can cure all of those things, Nick, unless the patient is very young or very old, or perhaps already weakened by a previous illness. Antibiotics will knock them out, but not this. It comes on the patient quickly and slowly, or slowly. It doesn't seem to matter. Nothing helps. Thank you, sweetheart. The thing escalates, backs up, escalates again. Debilitation increases. The swelling gets worse. Finally, death. I just need to warm myself up a little bit. Here we go. Somebody made a mistake, and they're trying to cover it up. Nick looked at him doubtfully, wondering if he had picked the words rightly from the doctor's lips, wondering if Soames might be raving. It sounds slightly paranoid, doesn't it? Soames asked, looking at him with weary humor. I used to be frightened of the youngest generation's paranoia. You know that? Always afraid someone was tapping their phones, following them, running computer checks on them, and now I find out they were right, and I was wrong. Life is a fine thing, Nick, but old age takes an unpleasantly high toll on one's dearly held prejudices, I find. What do you mean? Nick wrote. None of the phones in Shoyo work, Soames said. Nick had no idea if this was in answer to his question. Soames seemed to have given Nick's last note only the most cursory of glances, or if the doctor had gone off on some new tact. The fever could be making Soames' mind jump around, he supposed. The doctor observed Nick's puzzled face and seemed to think the deaf-mute might not believe him. Yes? Be right back.
Yes, babe. What's up? That's what. Oh, that's the. Right. That's or put it. You should double brush. Yeah. All right. Back over to Nick and Dr. Soames. What? Did it just hit you? The gate's trying to beat you up.
He's making some banana cornbread, I think. Anyway, the doctor observed Nick's puzzled face and seemed to think the deaf-mute might not believe him. Quite true, he said. If you try to dial any number not on this town circuit, you get a recorded announcement. Furthermore, the two Shoyo exits and entrances from the turnpike are closed off with barriers which say road construction. But there is no construction, only the barriers. I was out there. I believe it would be possible to move the barriers aside, but the traffic on the turnpike seems very light this morning, and most of it seems to consist of army vehicles, trucks, and jeeps. What about the other roads? Nick wrote. Route 63 has been torn up at the east end of town to replace a culvert, some said. At the west end of town, there appears to have been a rather nasty car accident. 2 cars across the road, blocking it entirely. There are smudge spots out, but no sign of state troopers or wreckers. He paused, removed his handkerchief and blew his nose. The men working on the culvert are going very slowly, according to Joe Rackman, who lives out that way. I was at the Rackmans about 2 hours ago, looking at their little boy, who was very ill indeed. Joe said that he thinks that the men at the culvert are in fact soldiers, though they're dressed in state road crew overalls and driving a state truck. How does he know? Standing up, some said. Workmen rarely salute each other. Nick got up too. Back roads, he jotted. Possibly, Soames nodded. But I am a doctor, not a hero. Joe said he wants guns in the cab of his truck. He saw guns in the cab of that truck. Army issue carbines. If one tried to leave Shoyo by the back roads, and if they were watched, who knows? And what might one find beyond Shoyo? I repeat, someone made a mistake, and now they're trying to cover it up. Madness. Madness. Of course, the news of something like this will get out. And it won't take long. And in the meantime, how many will die? Nick, frightened, only looked at Dr. Soames as he went back to his car and climbed slowly in. And you, Nick, Soames said, looking out the window to him. How do you feel? Cold, sneezing, coughing? Nick shook his head at each one. Will you try to leave town? I think you could, if you went by the fields. Nick shook his head and wrote, Those men are locked up. I can't just leave them. Vincent Hogan is sick, and the other two seem okay. I'll get them their breakfast, and then go see Mrs. Baker. You're a thoughtful boy, Soames said. That's rare. A boy in this degraded age who has a sense of responsibility is even rarer. She'll appreciate that, Nick, I know. Mr. Braceman, the Methodist minister, also said he would stop by. I'm afraid he'll have a lot of calls to make before the day is over. You'll be careful of those 3 you have locked up, won't you? Nick nodded soberly. Good. I'll try and drop by and check on you this afternoon. He dropped the car into gear and drove away, looking weary and red-eyed and shriveled. Nick stared after him, his face troubled, and then began to walk down to the truck stop again. It was open, but one of the 2 cooks was not in, and 3 of the 4 waitresses hadn't shown up for the 7 to 3 shift. What? Phoebe, come here. Phoebe, no. No, she wants to play. Phoebe, come here. Phoebe, come here. Come here. Phoebe, come here. All right, who? Harley or Phoebe? Call Harley. You mean Harley? Or Phoebe? Who was on the couch, Phoebe? Oh, wow. Well, I've got her now if you want to talk to Harley. What? Don't look at me like that. You're all hyper this morning. All hyper. All right. Back to reading. Good. I'll try to, let's see. Okay. So, and 4 waitresses hadn't shown up for their 7 to 3 shift. Nick had to wait a long time to get his order. When he got back to the jail, both Billy and Mike looked badly frightened. Vince Hogan was delirious, and by 6 that evening, he was dead. Chapter 19. That was a long chapter.